In the spring of 1942, the American kitchen began to change. Transformation did not arrive with the sound of aircraft or artillery. It appeared quietly, inside envelopes, newspaper columns, grocery store notices, and small paper booklets distributed through local schools and rationing boards. To many families, the war had initially seemed distant, a conflict described by radio announcers and illustrated by maps printed in the morning paper. But when rationing entered the home, the war became something that could be measured in spoonfuls of sugar, ounces of meat, and cups of coffee. Across the United States, the Office of Price Administration created systems intended to distribute scarce goods more fairly and prevent wartime inflation. Rationing programs were introduced gradually, beginning with products such as tires and sugar before expanding to gasoline and numerous foods. Every household had to learn a new vocabulary of stamps, points, ceiling prices, and expiration dates. To understand how this system affected ordinary people, imagine a working-class family living in Cleveland, Ohio during the early months of America's involvement in the war. The Millers were not unusually poor, nor were they wealthy. Thomas Miller worked long shifts at a factory that had recently begun producing military equipment. His wife, Helen, managed the household while caring for their 14-year-old daughter, Ruth, and their 9-year-old son, Danny. Before the war, their meals had been simple but dependable: eggs and toast in the morning, sandwiches packed for work and school, and meat with potatoes or vegetables at dinner. Helen rarely thought of cooking as political. Food was food. Kept her husband strong enough to work and her children healthy enough to grow. That changed on the morning she placed the family's first ration books on the kitchen table. The books were small enough to fit inside her purse, but Helen handled them with unusual care. Each contained rows of numbered stamps printed on thin paper. They were assigned to individual members of the household and could not simply be replaced if lost. Danny leaned over the table, fascinated by the designs. "Are those like money?" he asked. "Not exactly," Helen replied. "We still have to pay for the food." "Then what are they for?" Helen hesitated. She had attended a neighborhood meeting where a volunteer explained the system, but even she remained uncertain about some of the rules. "They tell the grocer how much we're allowed to buy." Danny looked at the book again. "Who decides that?" "The government." The boy frowned as if someone in Washington had suddenly joined them for breakfast. The introduction of sugar rationing was especially noticeable. Sugar was important not only for cakes and desserts but also for preserving fruit, preparing jams, sweetening coffee, and making many familiar recipes. Families had to register, declare the amount of sugar already in their homes, and use stamps when purchasing more. Purpose was not to eliminate sugar from civilian life, but to distribute limited supplies more evenly among millions of consumers. For Helen, the new restrictions transformed ordinary decisions into calculations. A birthday cake for Danny would use sugar that might otherwise last for several weeks. Canning peaches later in the summer would require planning in advance. Even the sugar bowl that had once remained in the center of the table was moved to a shelf near the stove, where Helen could watch how quickly it emptied. One evening, Thomas reached for the bowl after dinner. Helen looked up from the dishes. "Try half a spoon tonight." Thomas paused. "I worked 10 hours. "I know. And I can't have a spoonful of sugar in my coffee?" "You can. But if you use a full spoon every night, we may not have enough when the children's birthdays come." Thomas slowly returned half the sugar to the bowl. The exchange was small, almost ridiculous when compared with the sacrifices of soldiers overseas. Yet moments like this occurred in households throughout the country. The war was teaching families that private habits could have public consequences. Government posters and radio programs encouraged Americans to see conservation as a patriotic responsibility. Citizens were told that supplies saved at home could support troops and allies abroad. Campaigns urged households to avoid waste, reuse leftovers, collect cooking fats, plant gardens, and preserve seasonal produce. Kitchens became domestic command centers where food was planned, stretched, stored, and sometimes sacrificed. But patriotism did not make the system easy. The grocery store, Helen encountered shelves that looked different from one week to the next. Some familiar brands disappeared. Other goods remained available but were expensive or restricted. Ceiling prices were posted to prevent merchants from charging unreasonable amounts, yet a legal price meant little if the product itself was not there. Shopping required patience. Customers waited in lines, listened for rumors about deliveries, and adjusted their menus according to whatever could be found. A homemaker might arrive expecting to purchase canned peaches and leave with canned beets instead. She might have sufficient ration stamps for an item but discover that the store had sold its entire supply that morning. Ration stamps did not guarantee abundance. They were designed to protect a person's share of what remained. One Saturday, Helen entered the neighborhood grocery store carrying a handwritten list. She needed flour, sugar, coffee, shortening, canned tomatoes, and a small roast for Sunday dinner. Mr. Kaplan, the grocer, stood behind the counter with a pencil tucked above his ear. "No roast today, Mrs. Miller," he told her. "Nothing at all?" "I have liver." Helen glanced toward the display case. The liver was dark and glossy beneath the glass. Ruth disliked it, Danny claimed it smelled strange, and Thomas considered it a punishment disguised as dinner. "Any chicken?" "Gone before 9. "What about bacon?" Mr. Kaplan shook his head. Helen looked down at her list. Before the war, a missing item had been an inconvenience. Now it demanded an entirely different meal. "I'll take the liver," she finally said. Mr. Kaplan wrapped it in brown paper. "You're not the only one changing Sunday dinner." At home, Helen soaked the liver, sliced onions thinly, and fried everything in a small amount of carefully saved fat. She added mashed potatoes and carrots, hoping the familiar side dishes would distract the children. When Danny saw the meat, he stopped beside his chair. "What is that?" "Dinner. It looks like something from science class." "Sit down," Thomas said. Danny sat, but he did not lift his fork. Helen placed her hands on the table. "Your father works all day. I stood in line for nearly an hour. Mr. Kaplan had no chicken and no roast. This is what we have." The room became quiet. Ruth cut a small piece and tasted it first. "It's not terrible," she said. Danny stared at his sister. "That doesn't mean it's good." Thomas almost smiled, but Helen's expression stopped him. "This war is going to ask us to eat things we don't like," she said. "That is still easier than going hungry." Danny finally raised his fork. Meals such as this revealed one of the central realities of wartime cooking. Adaptation was rarely dramatic. It was repetitive, practical, and often frustrating. Families substituted one ingredient for another, accepted smaller portions, and learned recipes that made inexpensive foods appear more satisfying. Leftovers became especially valuable. A small amount of meat could be chopped and added to potatoes. Stale bread could become crumbs, stuffing, or bread pudding. Vegetable water could be saved for soup. Bones might be boiled for stock before being discarded. Food conservation campaigns had begun before the war, particularly during the difficult years of the Great Depression, but wartime shortages gave these habits new urgency. Helen began keeping a covered bowl in the icebox for usable scraps. Nothing entered the garbage without inspection. Monday's vegetables appeared in Tuesday's soup. Tuesday's soup was thickened and served again on Wednesday. Bacon grease, when bacon could be found, was stored in a jar rather than poured away. A spoonful could flavor beans, fry potatoes, or enrich a pan of cornbread. This economy of food required time and labor. The burden fell heavily on women, who were expected to protect their family's nutrition while cooperating with national conservation goals. They read government pamphlets, exchanged recipes with neighbors, studied newspaper columns, and attempted dishes built around ingredients their families had once ignored. Some advice was useful. Some produced meals that no amount of patriotic language could make appealing. One government-inspired recipe suggested stretching ground meat with cereal or breadcrumbs. Another recommended replacing scarce fats with alternatives. Cakes could be made with less sugar, fewer eggs, or no butter. Coffee could be weakened, extended, or replaced with roasted grain beverages. The Miller home, Helen tested a wartime chocolate cake using less sugar and no frosting. Danny took one bite. It tastes unfinished. It is finished. Then something went wrong. Ruth laughed. Helen looked at the plain cake and then began laughing as well. Thomas joined them, and for a moment the tension around the table disappeared. Humor became its own kind of household resource. Families joked about thin coffee, mysterious casseroles, and recipes that promised to taste exactly like foods they did not resemble. Complaining was common, but so was determination. Most Americans understood that conditions in the United States were far less severe than those endured in combat zones and occupied countries. The shortages were real, but they existed within a nation whose farms and industries remained enormously productive. Still, the future promised greater restrictions. By the end of 1942, coffee was rationed. In 1943, point systems would govern the purchase of meats, fats, cheeses, canned goods, and other processed foods. Shopping would soon require families to consider not only money and availability, but also the changing point value of each product. Helen did not yet know how complicated her weekly grocery trips would become. She only knew that the small books on her kitchen shelf were becoming as important as the dollars in Thomas's pay envelope. One cold evening, she sat alone at the table after the children had gone to bed. The radio played softly in the next room. A news announcer described fighting overseas while Helen opened a notebook and wrote down everything remaining in the pantry. 2 pounds of flour. Half a container of coffee. 3 cans of tomatoes. 1 can of peaches. A small jar of bacon grease. Enough sugar for perhaps 3 weeks. She studied the list for several minutes. Then she turned to a clean page and wrote a new heading. Meals that waste nothing. The next phase of the war would be fought far from Helen's kitchen. But inside that modest Cleveland home, another struggle was beginning. The daily effort to turn limited ingredients into nourishment, comfort, and a sense of normal life. And as more foods disappeared behind stamps and point values, Helen would discover that following the rules was only the beginning. The real challenge was learning how to feed 4 people when every meal required sacrifice. By the spring of 1943, grocery shopping had become a weekly exercise in arithmetic. The ration books that once seemed strange were now part of daily life. Alongside cash, shoppers carried blue and red stamps, each assigned to different categories of food. Blue points were generally used for processed items such as canned fruits and vegetables, while red points covered meats, fats, cheese, and certain dairy products. The value of individual products could change from one month to the next, depending on supply. For families like the Millers, this meant that planning a meal began long before anyone entered the kitchen. On Thursday evenings, Helen spread the ration books across the table and studied the newspaper. The local rationing chart was printed beside advertisements for war bonds, factory jobs, and government appeals to conserve fuel. She circled the point values with a pencil while Ruth copied a shopping list into a notebook. Canned peas are higher again, Helen said. Ruth looked over her shoulder. What about green beans? Lower this week. Danny hates green beans. Danny doesn't assign the point values. From the doorway, Danny protested. I heard that. Good, Helen replied. Then you already know what we're having. Point system was designed to give consumers flexibility. Families were not told exactly which cut of meat or which can of vegetables they had to buy. Instead, they decided how to spend their limited points. A household could use many points on a desirable roast or stretch them across cheaper cuts and smaller portions. But flexibility did not mean freedom from difficult choices. Helen quickly discovered that a family's ration points could disappear faster than its money. A few cans of fruit, a pound of cheese, some shortening, and a small quantity of meat could consume a large portion of the month's allowance. Once the stamps were used, there was no legal way to buy more rationed food until the next set became valid. The grocery store, customers compared prices, points, and availability with growing expertise. 7 points for that? One woman asked, holding a can of peaches. Mr. Kaplan nodded. That's the new value. It was 5 last week. I don't make the rules. No, but you're the one telling me. The line behind her shifted impatiently. Helen watched these arguments almost every week. Most people followed the regulations, but frustration was common. Rumors circulated about hidden supplies, dishonest merchants, and neighbors who somehow always seemed to have more sugar or meat than everyone else. The black market was real, though its reach varied from place to place. Some people purchased meat without surrendering stamps. Others used counterfeit coupons or made private arrangements with farmers and shopkeepers. Government officials warned that black market buying damaged the rationing system and deprived law-abiding families of their fair share. Thomas occasionally heard men at the factory discussing such opportunities. I know someone who can get us a ham, he told Helen one evening. She stopped slicing potatoes. How? He knows a butcher. Do we have the points? He says we wouldn't need them. Helen placed the knife on the cutting board. Then we don't need the ham. Thomas sighed. It would be one meal. It would be one meal bought by pretending the rules are only for other people. I'm working on military engines 10 hours a day. And thousands of other men are working just as long. Thomas leaned against the counter. He was tired, hungry, and ashamed that the smell of fried onions had made the illegal ham sound reasonable. Helen softened her voice. I miss Sunday roast too. But I don't want the children learning that sacrifice is only important when it's convenient. Thomas looked toward the dining room, where Danny was doing arithmetic homework and Ruth was repairing a torn blouse. All right, he said. No ham. Meals became smaller in meat and larger in everything else. Helen learned to use beans, eggs, potatoes, oatmeal, and seasonal vegetables as the foundation of the family diet. She prepared meatloaf stretched with breadcrumbs and grated vegetables. Ground beef appeared in sauces rather than as full portions. Stews allowed a few ounces of meat to flavor an entire pot. One evening, she served what she called victory stew. Danny examined his bowl. Where's the victory? Under the carrots, Ruth said. Danny moved a carrot with his spoon. There's no victory under there. There are 3 pieces of beef in this pot, Helen said. Finding one is part of the war effort. Even Thomas laughed. The family had learned that wartime meals were easier to accept when humor accompanied them. But Helen remained concerned about nutrition. Government pamphlets urged homemakers to provide balanced meals despite restrictions. Children still needed milk, vegetables, protein, and sufficient calories. Factory workers needed enough food to sustain long shifts. Rationing did not remove this responsibility. It made it more difficult. As fresh produce became increasingly valuable, communities across the United States promoted victory gardens. Americans were encouraged to grow food in backyards, vacant lots, schoolyards, and public spaces. Gardening reduced pressure on commercial agriculture and transportation while giving families direct access to vegetables. The miller's backyard was small, bordered by a wooden fence and shaded in the afternoon by the neighboring house. Thomas doubted it could produce anything useful. We barely get enough sun, he said. We get enough for weeds, Helen replied. We'll give tomatoes a chance. With Ruth and Danny helping, they dug narrow rows behind the house. They planted tomatoes, carrots, green beans, lettuce, onions, and radishes. The work was more difficult than the cheerful posters suggested. The soil was hard and filled with stones. Insects attacked the leaves. Heavy rain washed away some seeds while summer heat threatened others. Danny grew impatient. When do we eat something? When it grows. How long does that take? Longer when you keep digging it up to check. Their neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, had been gardening for years. She showed Helen how to stake tomato plants, protect young lettuce, and save eggshells for the soil. Plants are like children, Mrs. Kowalski said. They need attention every day and they still refuse to do what you tell them. By July, the backyard had changed. Green vines climbed wooden supports. Tomatoes ripened beneath broad leaves. Children pulled carrots from the ground and shouted when they saw how large they had become. Even Thomas, who had predicted failure, began checking the garden each evening after work. The first tomato was divided into 4 slices. Danny stared at his portion. "That's all." "That tomato took weeks," Helen said. He ate it slowly. Victory Gardens offered more than food. They gave families a sense of control during a period shaped by uncertainty. News from overseas was often frightening. Casualty lists appeared in newspapers. Families waited for letters from sons, brothers, and husbands. Factory schedules changed. Prices remained a concern. A garden was small, but it was visible. Seeds became plants. Work produced results. In a time when individuals could do little to influence global events, growing food felt immediate and useful. The harvest also created a new challenge: preservation. Fresh vegetables would not last through winter, so Helen joined a community canning program organized at a nearby school. Women gathered in a converted kitchen where long tables held jars, lids, pots, and baskets of produce. Some brought vegetables from their gardens. Others purchased food in bulk or received surplus crops from local farms. The room was hot and crowded. Steam clouded the windows and the metal lids clattered constantly. An instructor explained each step carefully. Jars had to be cleaned, filled correctly, sealed, and processed safely. Mistakes could spoil food or make it dangerous. Helen worked beside Mrs. Kowalski and a young mother named Margaret, whose husband was serving overseas. Margaret held up a jar of beans. "Do you think he would believe I know how to do this?" "Send him a photograph," Helen said. "He'll think someone else made them." Mrs. Kowalski tightened a lid. "Then send him the beans." The women laughed, but Margaret's expression soon became distant. "He writes that the food is terrible," she said. "I wish I could send him a real dinner." Helen understood. Cooking had always been one way of caring for someone. War had separated that care from the people who needed it most. A jar of beans could not cross an ocean easily, and a home-cooked meal could not reach a battlefield. Still, the women preserved what they could. At home, Helen arranged the finished jars on a basement shelf. Green beans, tomatoes, carrots, and pickled beets stood in careful rows. They represented hours of labor, but also future meals that would not require ration points. Ruth counted the jars. 23. 24, Helen corrected. "There's another behind the basket." Danny looked disappointed. "Did we can anything good?" "These are good. I mean something sweet." Helen pointed to 2 jars at the end of the shelf. "Peaches." His face brightened. "When can we eat them?" "Winter." "What if winter takes too long?" "Then you'll have plenty of time to learn patience." Food was not the only thing being saved. Cooking fats had become part of the national war effort. Families were encouraged to collect excess fat and take it to local meat dealers because glycerin derived from fat could be used in explosives and other military materials. Helen saved what little grease remained after cooking. It seemed strange that the contents of a kitchen jar could have any relationship to bombs or ammunition, but the campaign reinforced the idea that nothing should be wasted. One afternoon, Danny carried a container of fat to the butcher shop with great seriousness. "Is this going to help make a bomb?" he asked. The butcher raised an eyebrow. "Eventually, perhaps." "How big a bomb?" "Not very big from that jar." Danny looked disappointed. "It took us 2 weeks." The butcher smiled. "Wars are won with millions of small jars." That sentence stayed with Helen. Millions of small jars. Millions of small gardens. Millions of meals prepared with less sugar, less meat, and less waste. No single household sacrifice would decide the outcome of the war, but the entire system depended on ordinary people cooperating again and again. By autumn, the Millers had become more skilled at wartime living. Helen could calculate points quickly. Ruth had learned several meatless recipes. Thomas no longer complained when coffee was weak. Danny still complained about green beans, but he ate them. Yet beneath their growing confidence remained a deeper anxiety. One evening, a telegram arrived at the home of a family 2 streets away. Their eldest son had been killed overseas. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Women brought casseroles, bread, and preserved vegetables to the grieving household. Helen prepared a potato dish using part of the family's cheese ration. Ruth watched her measure the ingredients. "That's a lot of points," she said quietly. "I know. Will we have enough for the rest of the month?" "We'll manage." The next day, Helen carried the dish across the neighborhood. The streets looked ordinary. Children played near the sidewalks. Factory smoke drifted above the rooftops. Somewhere, a radio played dance music. Inside the grieving family's home, however, the war was no longer distant. That evening, the Millers ate vegetable soup and bread. No one complained. Rationing had begun as a collection of rules, stamps, and point values. But as the war continued, it became something more personal. It revealed what families were willing to surrender, what neighbors were willing to share, and how food could carry comfort when words were inadequate. The Millers' pantry was fuller now with jars from the garden, but the months ahead would bring new pressures. Winter would limit fresh produce. Factory work would become more demanding. Letters from overseas would grow increasingly important. And soon, the family would face a question that no ration chart could answer. How long could people preserve a sense of normal life when the war kept reaching closer to home? By the winter of 1944, the Miller family no longer needed to study every rationing instruction as if it were written in a foreign language. The system had become familiar. Helen knew which stamps belonged to meat and fats, which applied to processed foods, and how many meals she could build around a small package of ground beef. She could look at a nearly empty pantry and imagine 3 dinners instead of 1. Ruth could prepare vegetable soup without supervision. Danny had learned that complaining did not make sugar appear more quickly. Even Thomas had stopped asking when meals would return to normal. Normal had become difficult to define. In the kitchen, ordinary objects carried the history of the war. The ration books rested in a drawer near the stove. Glass jars lined the basement shelves. Coffee tin contained saved cooking fat. Newspaper recipes were folded beside Helen's handwritten meal plans. The backyard garden had been cleared for winter, but its final potatoes and onions remained stored in wooden boxes. Each object represented a small adjustment that had gradually reshaped the family's life. The Millers were not starving. Most American families were not. Grocery stores still carried food, and the nation's farms continued producing enormous quantities. But abundance could no longer be treated as automatic. The family had learned to consider the destination of every ingredient, every leftover, and every ration point. Chicken was no longer just a chicken. It was Sunday dinner, Monday sandwiches, Tuesday soup, and stock for another meal. A cup of sugar was not merely something stirred into coffee. It might become a birthday cake, a jar of preserved fruit, or a gift for a neighbor whose son had returned home wounded. Nothing was simply consumed. Everything was planned. That winter, the war felt both distant and painfully close. American forces were advancing in Europe, but the newspapers continued publishing casualty lists. Thomas worked longer shifts at the factory as production intensified. Ruth's school organized scrap drives and collected supplies. Danny followed military maps in the newspaper, moving small pencil marks across countries whose names he had only recently learned to pronounce. Letters became the most important objects in many homes. Helen's younger brother, Robert, was serving overseas. His messages arrived irregularly, sometimes separated by weeks. He wrote little about danger. Instead, he asked about the garden, the neighborhood, and Helen's cooking. In one letter, He wrote that he dreamed of sitting at the Miller table and eating an entire roast without anyone mentioning ration points. Helen read the sentence twice. Then she placed the letter beside the stove and began preparing dinner. That evening, the family ate a casserole made from potatoes, onions, leftover vegetables, breadcrumbs, and a small amount of cheese. Danny studied his plate. "Uncle Robert wants a roast," he said. "So does everyone," Thomas replied. "Will we have one when he comes home?" Helen looked down at the casserole. "If we can find one. No stretching it with bread? Not that day. No carrots underneath? Not unless he asks for them." Danny smiled. For a moment, Robert's return seemed certain and close enough to plan. The promise of a future meal became a way of imagining the end of the war. Families often spoke about what they would cook when restrictions disappeared. Some dreamed of thick steaks, buttered bread, rich cakes, or strong coffee. Others wanted simpler things: an egg without counting, bacon without guilt, or enough sugar to make preserves and still fill the kitchen bowl. These imagined meals were rarely about hunger alone. They represented reunion. They represented sons returning from military service, husbands walking through familiar doors, and families sitting together without listening for bad news on the radio. Helen began saving one jar of peaches from the previous summer's harvest. The other jars were opened gradually through the winter, but this one remained untouched at the back of the basement shelf. When Danny asked why they could not eat it, she gave the same answer each time. "It's for your uncle. What if he doesn't want peaches? He'll want them. What if he wants cake? Then he can have both." Ruth understood that the jar had become more than food. It was a promise that Robert would return and that the family would once again have a reason to celebrate. By early 1945, optimism was growing, though no one trusted it completely. The news from Europe suggested that Germany's defeat might be approaching. Factory conversations became more hopeful. Church services included prayers for a swift end to the fighting. But the Pacific War continued, and American families knew that victory in one region would not bring every soldier home. The Millers kept rationing. Helen continued planning meatless meals. Thomas continued saving grease. Ruth repaired clothing instead of replacing it. Danny worked in the garden when spring returned, though he claimed military strategy was more interesting than pulling weeds. One afternoon, he and Helen planted beans along the fence. "Will we need a victory garden after the war?" he asked. Helen pressed soil around a seed. "Gardens were useful before the war. But will we have to grow food?" "We never had to." Danny looked confused. "You said we were helping." "We were." "Then why didn't we have to?" Helen sat back on her heels. Helping, she explained, did not always mean doing something because no other choice existed. Sometimes it meant doing what was available because millions of other people were doing the same. Their garden had not won a battle, but it had reduced what the family needed from stores. It had taught them to preserve food, share produce, and waste less. Danny considered this. So the beans helped a little? A little. And millions of gardens helped a lot? That was the idea. He covered another seed with soil. "Then this row is mine." In May, news came that the war in Europe had ended. Church bells rang. Factory whistles sounded across the city. People poured into the streets, laughing, crying, waving flags, and embracing strangers. Radios carried speeches and reports of celebrations from across the country. Thomas arrived home early from the factory. Ruth ran outside when she heard the shouting. Danny asked whether Uncle Robert would return immediately. Helen stood in the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter. Relief came first, then caution. Robert was alive, according to his most recent letter, but the military had not released him. The war against Japan continued. Thousands of families were still waiting. Other families had received telegrams that made celebration impossible. That evening, the Millers joined their neighbors outside. Mrs. Kowalski brought a loaf of bread. Mr. Kaplan closed his store early and carried bottles of soda for the children. Someone played music through an open window. There was no roast. There was no grand feast. Helen prepared sandwiches, potato salad, pickled vegetables, and a small cake made with sugar she had saved over several weeks. The meal was modest, but nobody complained. Mrs. Kowalski raised her cup. To the boys coming home, the adults repeated the words. Helen looked around the table at familiar faces. Some were smiling. Others were thinking of people who would not return. The celebration was real but incomplete. When Japan surrendered later that summer, the streets filled again. This time, the hope of reunion seemed stronger. Yet the end of combat did not immediately erase the habits and restrictions of wartime life. Supply systems needed time to adjust. Some rationing continued. Certain foods remained difficult to obtain. People who had spent years counting points did not instantly forget how to save. Helen still scraped bowls carefully. She still stored leftovers in the icebox. Thomas still drank coffee weaker than he had before the war. Ruth still checked old newspaper recipes before using precious ingredients. In September, another letter arrived from Robert. He was coming home. Danny ran through the house shouting the news. Ruth began planning where he would sleep. Thomas asked whether the neighborhood butcher could find a roast. Helen went down to the basement. The shelves were nearly empty after the long winter and summer. A few jars of vegetables remained. The back behind an old basket stood the jar of peaches. Dust covered the lid. She lifted it carefully and carried it upstairs. Robert arrived on a cool October afternoon wearing his uniform and carrying a worn canvas bag. He looked thinner than Helen remembered. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she embraced him. Danny circled his uncle with questions. Ruth tried not to cry. Thomas shook Robert's hand before pulling him into a second embrace. That evening, the family sat around the table. Thomas had found a small roast, though it was not as large as Danny had imagined. Helen surrounded it with potatoes, onions, and carrots. There was bread with real butter, purchased after standing in a long line. The center of the table sat the jar of peaches. Robert noticed it immediately. "You saved those?" "For more than a year," Helen said. He looked at her with disbelief. "You should have eaten them. We had others. You wrote that supplies were tight." "They were." Robert touched the side of the jar. "Why save this one?" Helen did not answer immediately. Because the jar had been proof that she believed he would return. Because opening it without him would have felt like surrendering that belief. Because during the darkest months of the war, a few peaches preserved in syrup had allowed the family to picture one more dinner together. Instead, she simply said, "They were yours." After the meal, Helen opened the jar and divided the peaches among 5 bowls. Danny looked at his portion. "That's all." Everyone laughed, including Robert. Peaches were softer than fresh fruit and slightly darker after their long storage. But to the Millers, they tasted better than anything they had eaten in years. The family's wartime experience was not heroic in the traditional sense. They had not fought on battlefields or made decisions that appeared in history books. They had planted beans, collected grease, counted stamps, reused leftovers, and learned to cook with less. Millions of American families did the same. Their sacrifices were uneven and sometimes uncomfortable. Their patriotism existed beside frustration, temptation, and exhaustion. Some meals failed. Some rules were misunderstood. Some people cheated the system while others gave up food they could barely spare. Yet the larger effort depended on these ordinary households. Wartime cooking revealed how closely national events could enter private life. Government policy reached kitchen shelves. Military supply needs changed family recipes. Global conflict altered the contents of lunchboxes, grocery bags, and children's birthday cakes. The meals prepared during those years were often remembered not because they were delicious, but because they carried meaning. Casserole represented adaptability. A garden represented participation. A preserved jar represented hope. When rationing finally faded, many families returned eagerly to familiar foods. Sugar bowls were filled again. Meat portions grew larger. Coffee became stronger. Store shelves slowly recovered their variety. But some wartime habits remained. People who had learned to waste nothing continued saving scraps. Families kept gardening. Recipes created during shortages remained in kitchen drawers. Children who had grown up counting points carried memories of a time when food required thought, patience, and cooperation. For the Millers, the war ended not with a speech or a parade, but with 5 people sitting at a kitchen table. The roast was small. Peaches were divided carefully. And for the first time in years, every chair was occupied. That was enough.